All right, so the first chapter that we are talking about in your textbook is chapter 1, which is titled An Introduction to Capitalism, basically. And this first set of videos is going to have to do with both the basics of the course as well as the first chapter in your textbook. Now, something that you've probably noticed if you've taken the time to go look at the core textbook online is that it's got a lot of material in it. So my goal with these PowerPoint slides is to consolidate what I think some of the most important takeaways are for you. So if you're finding the reading challenging, cross-referencing it with the annotated slides in the content section of the Brightspace page is going to be a really good resource for making some sense of what it is you're seeing. So jumping straight in, Econ 202, Introduction to Macroeconomics, a key concept that we think about in this class is the topics that macroeconomics deals with. What is macroeconomics? Well, in the most basic sense, macroeconomics is the aggregation or the adding up of all of the individual components of a system that we may have seen in Intro to Micro. So here we're thinking about individuals, we're thinking about firms, we're thinking about banks, we're thinking about country level changes, and so on. So what topics does macro deal with? Ordinarily, I would put this out to you guys and I would ask for suggestions. But here are some of the commonly offered topics that people bring up when I tend to do this in a normal face-to-face scenario. People talk about GDP. GDP tends to be the measure we use for the size of an economy or the health of an economy. And among other things, it tracks consumption, expenditure on goods and services. It tracks firms' spending on production, investment expenditure, and we also think about trade here. We might also think about employment and unemployment. So we might think about whether firms are hiring or whether firms are firing people and what implications that has for GDP as a whole. We might think about the price level. We might think about how prices are changing over time, and if they are rising, that's what we call inflation. Often when people think about inflation, they think about the value of the dollar, the value of whatever domestic currency an economy uses. And in that scenario, we're really thinking about exchange rates. We're thinking about the price of other currencies in terms of our own or vice versa. Finance is a big topic that comes up in macro. My own work focuses a lot on the role that banks play in an economy at the broad level, thinking about whether banks are lending, how banks are lending, what assets they are creating, thinking about the implications that banks' behavior has for interest rates or asset prices, and also thinking about the relative activity that banks engage in domestically and abroad. And then finally, a huge component of macro is thinking about policy. Thinking about fiscal policy, which is where we think about governments spending and governments taxing, and also monetary policy. So anyone who's been thinking about the Federal Reserve has been thinking about interest rates and the quantity of money circulating in the economy as a whole. A question that I'm putting out to you guys, and you'll see this is the first discussion board assignment or the first worksheet assignment in Brightspace, is asking what macroeconomic topics you care about most. So I always like to do this because it gives me a sense of what students find interesting, what students care about, and again, what I really love about macroeconomics is how applied to the real world it is. Virtually every topic that we talk about is something that you encounter in some way or another in the course of your lives. So for one of your very first assignments, and it's a really, really low stakes introduction to the worksheets, I just want you guys to take some time to think about what macroeconomic variables you care about and why. Introductions. Well, I've introduced myself a little bit, but once again, my name is Nina Ihacker. I am a professor in the economics department at the University of Rhode Island. This is my 4th year at URI. It is my 4th year teaching this class. And again, it is one of my very favorites. This course is about macroeconomics writ large. It introduces you to the building blocks of the global macroeconomy, thinking about how firms and households and governments and banks all fit together. It's also about capitalism. It's also about the role of profit motivation in all of these different processes and so on. And then finally, it's about policy. It's about the decisions that governments make and the outcomes of that intervention, whether we're thinking about fiscal policy or whether we're thinking about monetary policy. Some key concepts in this chapter, there are a lot of them. Inequality is essential one that shows up early on. GDP and income is another big topic that shows up. What does it mean for an economy to grow over time? How do we measure that? What factors are intrinsic to growth? How is the economy, how is the environment important for growth potential? How does property matter? What is physical capital? And then your book delves a little bit into ownership and specialization. We spend far less time thinking about that. But if you find yourself really interested in this, you can definitely read those sections in the chapter. And then finally, thinking about markets, institutions, and the government and the economy as a whole.